This is the 350th anniversary of the first road atlas. It was meant to create a new age. Nothing like it had existed before. Published in 1675, it's a fabulous object. A road atlas and gazetteer of England and Wales, it contained information that had never before been collected. It displayed over 7,000 miles of roads at a scale of 1 inch to the mile, accompanied by information about the markets and administration of every settlement on them, making the land accessible in a completely new way. It's 40 centimeters high, weighs 8 kilograms, and the cost of creating it was, in modern terms, millions of pounds. Its creator, John Ogilby, dedicated it to Charles II as a way of enriching the country. I have attempted to improve our commerce and correspondency by illustrating your Majesty's highways from shore to shore, from this great emporium and prime centre of the kingdom. To us it seems to be perfectly innocent, until we actually look at it. It was born of the scientific revolution, the roads measured with scientific precision by a perambulator, that's the man, with a measuring device called a waywiser. What a boon to mankind! But when I was asked in 2008 to make a series for BBC Wales following Terry Jones of Monty Python as he walked Ogilby's roads in the Principality, I stared at the opening map in bewilderment. It showed the traveller in great detail how to get from London to Aberystwyth. Why? There was no commerce here, and the road was almost impassable. The accompanying text describes it as a kind of morass. No one except a couple of Welsh drovers wanted to go from London to Aberystwyth in 1675. A few poor houses and a ruined castle. Why start the great atlas with that? This book is not what it says it is. But it was created at phenomenal expense, took thousands of man-hours, was guided by leading members of the Royal Society, and was an enormous effort of the best engravers. What was it really for? This wasn't the first book with this title. Ogilby carefully designed his title page as a reference to the great work of that title written by William Camden almost 100 years before. That Britannia was a county history of great estates, originally in Latin, and published without a single map. The English maps that were published before Ogilby were county maps, tapestries of lordship without roads. This is John Speed's map of the West Riding from 1612. Whatever it was for, it was not to help anyone find their way over the land. It shows rivers, parks, towns, and boundaries. If you didn't know how to get from York to Leeds, this wouldn't help. These two places are shown as settlements on rivers with no overland connection at all. I've circled them in yellow so that you can find them. Knowledge of the land was privately owned, and those who had no business on it could be stranded unless they paid for guides. There was a King's Highway between York and Leeds through Tadcaster, but even the king would have trouble finding out where it was. This Britannia was a different country from Camden's. The Civil War had swept away the past with a higher death rate than any British war before or since. History and authority were overthrown. Britain had dared cut the head off its king and abolish monarchy. This cartoon, showing Cromwell presiding over the destruction of the royal oak, from which hangs monarchy and law, probably dates from 1648. Then in 1660, his republic too was swept away, and a new kind of monarchy was invented. It needed a new text, with new kinds of information for new people in the King's English, and counties didn't figure in it. This Britannia is open for business, and all roads lead to commerce, greatness and glory, in theory. That's what the frontispiece proclaims, and one of the travellers has a page in his hand. Up to its appearance, if you wanted to know about highways, you'd have to go to an almanac, that annual compendium of useful legal, medical, astronomical and geographical information the granddaddy of Wikipedia, hanging on a peg in the kitchen. That would list the roads. But of course, if you tried to take one of the roads that were listed, you'd probably get lost because it never told you which way to go at a fork in the road, and there were lots and lots of forks. Ogilby's Great Atlas changed all that. For the first time, it provided a map of the roads over the whole of England and Wales, including between York and Leeds. It showed that that road continued on for 106 miles and 4 furlongs to Westchester, and there were clear printed directions. If you had the page with you, you would not get lost. From York to Tadcaster, crossing the wharf and bearing to the right, leave Newton and Bramham and some woods on the same hand, and come to Thorner, a long discontinued village. And so it goes on, leading you turn by turn until reaching Seacroft, a scattering village with an inn or two in it. Thence by some coal pits and the White Horse Inn on the right are brought at 24 miles to Kirkgate Lease, a small village, and 4 furlongs further descending Worrell Hill, you enter Leeds. As easy as that. John Ogilby had made the first road map of any country in the world. He was the least qualified person to do it you could imagine. He was actually a showman who'd staged the great public spectacle of the royal coronation. Although he held the title of the king's cosmographer, he knew nothing of astronomy or geometry. He had no political power, no family connections, and no social position. But as cosmographer royal, he would try to place in Charles's hands the power to unmake history. Sometimes referred to as the Merry Monarch, Charles II is described as a lightweight womanizer, but that was the public show behind which was a man with a carefully managed agenda. He had become king by agreeing to the newly invented role of a regal figurehead, but he remained privately committed to fully restoring the absolute monarchic power that his father believed in. He intended to be unshackled from the limits of Parliament and to run the country in a progressive, scientific way, as a sovereign similar to his cousin Louis XIV of France. But he would have to achieve that in a way that went quite unnoticed and avoided confrontation. Britannia was the map of the roads that would help him undo the Civil War. That was its stated purpose, reviving and propagating the great soul of the world, commerce and correspondency, in maintaining privileges, encouraging industry, and inciting the whole kingdom to a noble emulation of recovering a pristine splendour, establishing a present greatness, or laying foundations of a future glory. The idea was that this would be under a glorious sovereign, Britannia's own son king. That's why the frontispiece shows Britannia under the military control of a royal bastion. And over the gate are images taken from portraits of the king and his father, with the restored Charles II showing off his future kingdom to the martyred Charles I. But to restore royal power would require dexterity and subtlety. Charles II knew that at the Restoration his position and his kingdom had been insecure. The meaning and feeling of majesty had been lost and largely forgotten after his father's execution. He'd been asked to return from exile and assume the restored throne after the Republic collapsed, but the magic of kingship had evaporated. Britain was full of different ideas about the future in a population that had lost traditional respect for authority. The first thing he needed was to put on a spectacular demonstration of the appearance of monarchy, so that his presence transformed the very quality of the air around him. This was entrusted to Ogilby. He'd been an exact contemporary of Charles I, and when he was 19 he was hired as a dancing master to the then heir to the throne. He later became master of the revels in Dublin. He was a dancer, a poet, an unwavering believer in the metaphysical authority of true kingship, and he was a theatrical producer. A producer, as I well know, has only one job: to make everyone he touches fall completely in love with the show he's putting together, to surrender to it. John Ogilby was given a free hand to create Charles II's coronation as a theatrical event on an astonishing scale, a stupendous courtly masque that took over the entire city of London. He created the performance of a new kind of kingdom. The very air that people breathed was changed as the fountains ran with wine. The dry oxygen of Puritan utility was perfumed with the intoxicating magic of royalty that had been banished by the Commonwealth and now swept through London. Ogilby set out to stun the city with an unforgettable, dazzling statement that made it extremely hard, perhaps impossible, to believe that civil war could ever return or royal authority be doubted. You're looking here at just 1/20th of the procession. And please notice the specially built arches. There were 4 of them, each 100 foot high. They were performance spaces, stages for actors and musicians to display the majesty of majesty as the king and his entourage wound their way to Westminster. Every arch carried the message in sculpture, music and speech of the Stuarts' place of triumph in the cosmic masque of history. This was the foundation on which Charles II was to build his kingship. This was the manifestation of all he believed in a coronation process designed by a showman, and Ogilby published and sold the souvenir programme. To understand what Ogilby was really doing, to understand his Britannia, you need to know who he really was. He worked very hard at making that impossible. John Aubrey, who worked for him, collected notes on the lives of his contemporaries, and the story he put together was that Ogilby was the son of an Edinburgh tailor who moved to London and ended up in a debtor's prison. Ogilby said that he won a lottery when he was 12 and so was able to get his father out of jail and buy an apprenticeship to a dancing master. Parts of the story may be true, but Aubrey was suspicious of the man he called a cunning Scot. His birthplace was known only to his astrologer Elias Ashmole, who recorded his horoscope in cipher after his subject was dead. It says that he was born not in Edinburgh, but Killymuir, north of Dundee, the seat of the Earl of Ereira. That may explain how a tailor's son ended up with such an impressive coat of arms. It was the same arms as the great Earl of Ereira, head of the clan Ogilvy and one of the staunchest supporters of the Stuarts through the civil wars. That star indicates a junior relative of the Earl, such as a younger son. He certainly had been apprenticed to a dancing master at a dance school teaching lawyers at Gray's Inn. That was where John Ogilby had learned what he knew of cosmology, the geometry of the heavens. In those days, dancing was compulsory for lawyers, and the dances they learned were a performance of cosmology. It linked law to the structure of the cosmos. Every Saturday through the winter, the Inns of Court held revels, courtly dances. All barristers and students were supposed to attend. When Ogilby was apprenticed, dance was at the heart of the law and social order. The whole cosmos was seen as a single living system whose laws passed down from heaven to earth through divinely appointed rulers, and those were the same laws that governed the movement of the moon and the planets. The ritual of dancing, what were called the old measures, was said to be how lawyers physically participated in the inner law of the world, which governed men and nature. The common law, they were taught, was not invented by kings or parliaments. It was the law inherent in the world from time immemorial, which lawyers learned to understand and interpret. The same laws that kept the stars in their courses gave power to princes and meaning to agreements. The Commonwealth and common sense, the common man and the commons of England, formed a harmony with the heavens themselves. The royal court and courts of justice stepped together to the tune of the music of the spheres. John Ogilby turned out to be a major dance talent. In fact, when he was 16, he took over the school where he worked. Through dance, he had learned and was teaching the cosmological underpinning on which the law had been built. That connected dance to majesty. Dancing was more admired at court than any intellectual or artistic gift. It was associated with beauty and also with morality and with being in harmony with the world. This intimate connection between dancing, morality and law meant that it also provided a foundation for political authority. The lawyer could learn through the dance to understand the mind of God. Nature, God, and humanity were bound by the same law, and while humans had the power to disrupt it, it would always prevail in the end. This was the understanding of law and polity which young Ogilby imbibed at Gray's Inn, and it remained with him for the rest of his life. In truth, this was his religion, and it would be the lifeblood of Ogilby's mysterious atlas. For a few years he danced himself, not in revels because he wasn't a gentleman, but in plays. Dancers performed before plays, after plays, and in the course of plays. And somehow the sight of his performances, his physical beauty, and his evidently growing reputation meant that by 1619 John Ogilby was dancing for this most courtly of all courtiers, the Marquis of Buckingham, in front of James I. James was in love with Buckingham. To have captured his attention was a huge achievement. It was said that everything Buckingham did was admired for the doer's sake. Buckingham was celebrated for his high leaps, and it was snarkily said that he jumped higher than ever Englishman did in so short a time, from a private gentleman to a dukedom. Perhaps Ogilby could do the same. He was now enrolled in a much more stellar place than Gray's Inn or a London stage. He was in the world of the richest and most powerful people in Britain, great aristocrats and royalty. The Court Masque was a ritualized dance drama, visually brilliant, extravagant and spectacular, whose narrative demonstrated that the king was the fount of order and well-being on a cosmic scale. Although the narrative was expounded in a spoken text, for which professional actors were employed, what was being carried was a musical dance spectacle. At the end, the whole court would dance and become participants in this world of imagined perfection. And now Ogilby was part of it. More than that, he was helping Prince Charles, heir to the throne, perform in a way that would make his father proud. Until, according to Ashmole's horoscope, Ogilby tried to leap too far, literally. He was a star performer, 18 years old, and he crashed to the ground on stage, damaging his leg forever. Permanently crippled, that was his last dance. But Charles danced well, and King James was a happy man. Ogilby had done his job well, and Buckingham would take care to repay the debt. There were now men at the highest level who trusted Ogilby as a delightful and capable teacher and would recommend him. He had learned how to survive in the company of kings, princes and dukes, and even earn their confidence. He could still work as a dance teacher, and his court connections found him a place as a dance master to the most celebrated young warrior in the land, Ralph Hopton. Hopton had personally rescued James's daughter Elizabeth, by then Queen of Bohemia, after the Battle of the White Mountain that began the 30 Years' War. Ogilby was hired to train Hopton's sisters to dance at his wedding. But it was Ogilby who learned most. Hopton trained him as a trooper. He took like a natural to the dance of pike and musket, and Hopton carried him off to the 30 Years' War in the company of other military gentlemen who had danced with him in royal masques and who all simply adored Elizabeth of Bohemia. 2/3 of them died of the plague without ever being allowed to land. Ogilby escaped, but became a prisoner of war in Dunkirk. When he was eventually ransomed, James had died, and his pupil, Prince Charles, was the king. Ogilby joined Buckingham now on an even more doomed expedition. It was a seaborne siege of the Ile de Ré. Even more men died with Buckingham than had perished with Hopton. As one of the few survivors, Ogilby found himself captaining a ship and getting it home. He knew nothing about sailing, but he knew how to make men work together. And then he was hired by the new Lord Deputy of Ireland, Wentworth, to ride in his entourage as a trooper and teach his new wife and children how to dance. That was when he decided to set up the first theatre in Dublin. And then Wentworth went back to England and was executed, and Ireland erupted in a vicious insurrection. The theatre was turned into a cowshed, and Ogilby was ruined. That's when he became a secret agent. His horoscope reveals in code that he was employed by the next Lord Deputy of Ireland, Ormond. There's no other record of this. No letter, no official report, nothing. He wasn't there as a dance teacher, that's for sure. There was now civil war in England and savage insurrection in Ireland. Ormond's job was to raise troops from the Catholics of South Ireland and deliver them to King Charles's commander in the west, who just happened to be Ralph Hopton. Ogilby was, I believe, the secret agent go-between. His loyalty to Charles was unquestioning. He believed in the law of the dance, which gave proper authority to kings, and which included the dance of pike and musket. But Ogilby's cosmology had lost its celestial footing. Galileo had triumphed, and the music of the spheres had been silenced. Earthly authority was no longer the cosmic centre. That shift had happened even as Ogilby's apprenticeship began. The earth was no longer the centre of creation, nor were its kings. As the world turned upside down, the banqueting house, built for royal masques, became the stage for the execution of the king. Later that year, Parliament banned dancing at the Inns of Court, and John Ogilby began to hunt for a new foundation for the old cosmology. Never mind whether the music of the spheres was out of date. He had learned a moral cosmology, and its foundations must exist here on earth. While savage lawlessness swept Ireland, he was shown the ancient Latin narratives of civil war and destruction, the Aeneid, which resolved chaos and slaughter with the necessary triumph of Augustus, the princeps, autocrat. Instead of teaching that political morality descended from the heavens, it made better sense to entrance people with the epic poetry of Virgil. But there was no complete English translation. Ogilby's solution was unique. He learned Latin to write a translation that conveyed the message he thought the country needed. Living with ancient and modern heroism and disaster, he fled from the collapse of Royalist Ireland, but was shipwrecked and captured. He was travelling with other Royalist agents, but no one found out who he was, and after he was brought to London in chains, he was set free, penniless. Welcome to Puritan Britain. The king had been executed. The great courtiers who'd been Ogilby's sponsors were all dead or fled abroad. Theatre and dance were banned. Never mind. He knew what he must do, and he'd managed to keep hold of his manuscript translation of Virgil. So he walked, limping, to Cambridge and found scholars who had been thrown out by the revolution and would help him improve his work. That is how John Ogilby, poet and classical translator, was born. This was meant to be a work of cosmological education, teaching the inner law of the world as demonstrated by the iron laws of history. spelt out by Virgil. Laws which would guarantee the return of the monarchy and true authority. It was lavishly produced and cost a fortune. He put his portrait on the frontispiece. In 1649 he appeared as a modest, respectable scholar. But when he produced the next version in 1654, he would have a very different portrait. He'd found his true self as a royalist gentleman, and he used his Early badge in the middle of his name to signal his identity. He couldn't say he'd been a secret agent for the cause, that would be fatal, but he could indicate that he was an Early, part of the family that was with the Stuarts to the end and was still with them. This linked Ogilby into the conspiracies of royalist aristocracy. He became a kind of literary guru, advising concealed machination rather than the danger of open rebellion against Cromwell. The royalists looked helpless, but had time and natural law on their side. He demonstrated that Virgil contained their message of hope, and that they could be bound together by owning a copy of this text in a huge, beautiful, heavily illustrated translation. This grand book, to which the quiet grand conspirators would subscribe, was a completely new kind of object. Its place was in a newly invented space, the library room of a great house, with books for the first time not kept in boxes, but sitting upright on shelves, showing off the intellect and wealth of their owner. Ogilby was shaping a new culture, designed to replace insolent Puritanism with a high aesthetic. He hired the best graphic artists, he imported the finest paper from France, he set up his own press to control the whole process. Ogilby had never been a ladies' man, but he needed to marry for money. Like some other printers, he chose a wealthy elderly widow. By sheer force of determination, he mastered printing, publishing, bookbinding, marketing, and he made a fortune. Again. Virgil's text demonstrated how political history is shaped by the world's inner moral structure. But it would be better to add a greater authority, Homer's, and Homer wrote in Greek. There were translations, but they didn't clearly convey the message that he wanted, so Mr. Ogilby the poet wanted to learn Greek to make a more carefully shaped translation of the Iliad. A challenge. He was 52, but he was told the stars were propitious. So he simply sat down and learned the language, and then produced his massive translation. It was hugely impressive, and it had a very clear purpose. Each illustration was dedicated to an oppressed royalist supporter. They would discover the Iliad as an essay on the authority of kings and the wickedness of rebellion. Ogilby's Homer believed in the divine right of kings and demonstrated it. When the Restoration happened, Ogilby had already embedded the royal throne at the heart of modern and classical civilization. Charles hoped Ogilby could even win over the Irish and reappointed him master of the revels there. He built a new theatre in Dublin. He put on the first play by an English female author in any professional theatre, with 2 remarkable female lead actors. It transferred to London, and so did he, coming back to his printing house and offering his stupendously expensive books as lottery prizes. And then it all went up in smoke. The Great Fire of London consumed his home, his press, and his entire stock. With clear sight and determination, he took stock of the ashes. The Inferno had cleared out his old books, which he saw were now past their sell-by date. Their job was done. He still had £5 left. He was still only 65, and one of his legs was perfectly okay. Reborn, John Ogilby, man of mystery, talent, and energy, rose from the ashes with a vision of limitless opportunity for what he called the conquest of the whole world. All London was rising from the ashes, intent on the commercial conquest of the whole world. Ogilby set up in the new Royal Exchange among the aristocracy of commerce to create great fat illustrated books that would guide them through overseas market opportunities. Such books were already available in Amsterdam, and by a happy chance Ogilby had learned Dutch when he was a prisoner of war in Dunkirk. He did a deal with a Dutch publisher and produced his own translations at breakneck speed. The world was his oyster, and in 1669 he began producing pearls named after markets. China, Japan, Africa, America, he was conquering the world. And then, of course, the English atlas. And that's when it all changed. In a world of secrets, Ogilby was about to be part of the biggest secret of his life. A plot so utterly incredible that for many years no one believed it could have existed. In 1667, when England was at war with the Dutch, they sailed up the Medway and inflicted a devastating defeat on the Royal Navy. Parliament refused to provide the money the Navy needed, and Charles was obliged to sign a humiliating peace. The stern of the captured English flagship, HMS Royal Charles, is still on display in Amsterdam. Charles was convinced that the king and the kingdom needed to break free of Parliament's control of finance. The only way he could do that would be with the help of France, and for that he would need to convert to Catholicism. He had no personal objection. He thought Catholicism more accepting of his own notion of royal authority. But many English were pathologically anti-Catholic, and he would need some guarantee of military support if this provoked a rebellion. So in 1670 he made this secret agreement with Louis XIV. This was the very, very secret Treaty of Dover. It begins, "A treaty of similar importance can hardly be found in any period of history." Incredibly, Charles agrees here to convert to Catholicism, and Louis agrees to provide him with all the income to run Britain. Charles will be able to change the result of the Civil War, getting rid of Parliament completely. And if the English rise up against their new absolute ruler, Louis will send a French army to crush them. Merry England was just a masquerade. Bringing in an invasion needed massive planning. The French army would need more than an almanac. Charles had to provide a step-by-step guide. Where could they be landed? How could they move around? That meant a new kind of map, with precise details of the roads, plus a description of the political and economic structure of all the towns and corporations that Charles would have to control. He needed something like a new doomsday book. Who could invent such a thing? And who could execute it? Who was totally committed, loyal beyond question, and who could keep secrets that would remain hidden for centuries? In 1671, he named John Ogilby as the royal cosmographer for this purpose. That explains the mystery of Ogilby's last and greatest work. Why Aberystwyth? Britannia's dedication mysteriously says, "I present your sacred majesty with an important novelty, the scale of peace and war, with pregnant hints of security." This was an investigation of possible landing places for the French, and Aberystwyth bore looking at, especially as the road shows the lead mines, which were also Charles I's silver mines, minting his currency during the Civil War. The key to its real meaning was that frontispiece. It looks like a celestial celebration of the arrival of road maps to guide the capital's travellers through this prosperous land. In fact, it's a coded essay on the book's real goal. For example, examine those people with a globe down on the corner. They've instruments for surveying, and they look startled. They would be. It shows Europe and Africa with the British Isles, but East and West are reversed. Ireland is east of England. The lettering isn't reversed, so this isn't an engraver's mistake. It's a deliberate clue. to something. But what? The overthrow of Charles I turned the world upside down. Now that had been corrected. Ogilby's purpose was to switch it, to make it turn in a new direction. This was the book of counter-revolution. Illustrations were bound into a book when you bought it, and Ogilby controlled who got to see this page. He didn't want everyone to see the clues, so they were not included in the copy provided to the censor. This is what the censor got. It's still in the Royal Archives at Windsor, and of course what's been blanked out is the key to the hidden message. So one way to find out what Britannia is really saying is to figure out what has been blanked out and why. Well, let's start by figuring out the geography of this landscape. The dead centre of the picture is a harbour town. That big tower on the left clearly represents one of London's gates with added cannon, and the statue of Charles II on it is gesturing towards the harbour. So it's important. I would assume that the road climbing up the mountain is going north and that the harbour town is in the west, but take a look at the riders setting out on the road. They've got a sheet of paper that's been blanked out. It shows, in reality, that north is behind them. So that harbour on their left is actually on the east coast. Flipping east and west is a theme here, as we saw on the globe. That's been blanked out for the censor too, of course. This frontispiece is all about flipping reality, changing direction. Now, take a closer look at the walled harbour in the dead centre of the picture. It looks like it's on the west coast, but we know from the message of the globe and the traveller's map that it's on the east. Its position says that it's the heart of the message, and the picture below is from a 1540 plan of Hull on the east coast. That's clearly the same town, a wall with a gate tower between a square tower on the left, a round tower on the right, and ships anchored to the left of the town. But I've made one change to the 1540 plan of Hull to make it fit the picture. I have flipped it left to right, east to west. Unless you knew that's how to read the image, you wouldn't recognize it. And I say that with confidence because I tried Ogilby's image on Hull's city archaeologist and he didn't recognize it. And he was the man who'd recently published it. So reading the frontispiece is like reading a code. And you get the correct reading confirmed when you look at the map being carried by the cherub up in the top right. It could have been any part of Britain, but it's not. There's Hull. And of course that too was blank on the censor's copy. So one of the statues on the gate is gesturing to Hull. As I've shown you, that's Charles II. The drawing is based on this picture of Charles II, done in 1653 when Charles had fled to France. In the painting, he's pointing to a French fleet, supposedly waiting to invade England in his support. The image now refers to the fleet France offered in the secret treaty to help him carry out his coup against Parliament. And if you follow the principle of flipping left and right, it becomes very clear. The French invasion fleet from the painting now seems to be anchored at Hull. Hull was the city where the Civil War began in 1642, when the city locked its gates against the king. It was also the last city to accept the restored Charles II. He was crowned in Westminster Abbey in April 1660, but Hull didn't recognise him for another 6 weeks. Charles II is showing his father that rebellion has been crushed, and that French fleet is an instrument of Stuart power. The connection between France and Britannia has been concealed in other ways too. The Royal Archives version of the frontispiece shows that road winding uphill as being empty. But in the published version, it wasn't empty at all. There's a coach on it. rather a special coach. It looks a bit ordinary to us, but it was very recognisable at the time because it was the first coach in England to have windows. It was a gift to Charles II from the French aristocrat Count Gramont in 1671, and very distinctive. The object was for Charles's ladies to be able to show themselves off in Hyde Park while protected from the weather. It was very well known, especially because of a famous spat over which of Charles's mistresses would get to be seen first in it. Lady Castlemaine was determined to be the one, but in fact it was Mary Stuart, Duchess of Richmond, with whom Charles was infatuated at the time. Her portrait became the most widely circulated of any woman before Queen Victoria, and for the same reason. She was quite literally on the money. She was the model for Britannia on the first English coin to carry the image, which he issued in 1672. It imitated this Roman coin, struck in 143 AD to commemorate the suppression of a rebellion in Britain. And that is what Charles's coin commemorated. The coach on the road was a French gift, and it carried Britannia through a land where rebellion had been suppressed. That's why on the other side of the coin, around the king's head, it says Carolus a Carolo. That weird motto, from Charles to Charles, really means Charles the sequel. The Civil War has been revisited, and this time the king won. That's the message of Ogilby's Roads. Which is why, if you look at the bottom left of the frontispiece, where you see the publisher himself examining the pages, the sheet he's looking at has also been blanked out. It says, the continuation of the road. The book was all about where to land the French army and what towns to control. It doesn't show any road to Liverpool, the most important port for Ireland. That was controlled by an anti-Stuart council with money and weapons, and I believe that's why it was not included in this Britannia. But the track from Holywell, of no conceivable use to anyone, goes past Flint Castle, a possible landing site. The text observes that Richard II had landed here from Ireland. It was also where Ogilby had landed Irish troops to help Charles I. This was a planning document for restoring Britain to the way it would have been if Charles I had won. Britannia is the map of a country yet to be created, its roads still to be travelled, the completion of the Stuart family project. And it worked, without provoking an uprising that needed the French army. Now that the land was only to be known as a set of routes, Ogilby had invented a powerfully controlling way of revealing it. The modern equivalent of Britannia now manages almost every road journey made, travelling through anonymised space which remains unrevealed to the traveller, who's entirely in the mapmaker's hand. This means that it's become possible for Google to conceal, for example, the large nuclear airbase near Eindhoven. In concealing Liverpool, Ogilby gave the impression that the way to Ireland was from Chester, which was actually silted up. That was why when William III wanted to ship an army from Chester to Dublin in 1689, he had to be told that Chester had no large ships, just a few barks for coasting. There was a place called Liverpool, on the other hand, that had 50 or 60 good ships of 50 to 200 tons. It just wasn't on the map. In fact, Charles managed to swerve around Parliament using French subsidies and careful management, and the military option in the secret Treaty of Dover was never called upon. By the time he died, all opposition to him had been crushed, the corporate structure of every single town listed in Britannia had been changed to install loyal men, Parliament had been put away, taxes had been replaced by French grants, and the crown was passed to a Catholic monarch. and Charles had managed it without provoking any rebellion at all. Ogilby had delivered what was needed. It was just that Charles's successor, James, couldn't handle it. But this story of the meaning of Britannia, Volume 1, has been kept a secret from then until now.